Well, hey, long time, no see. I know, it's been a while. How are you? How are things? Let's see if I can remember how to do this. Welcome to my little video series that I call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that is what I've decided to make videos about. If you also like true crime and want to feel better about your own makeup skills, you should totally like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday, yes, normally every Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. I can't believe I remembered my intro. How are you? How are you? Yes, I know my 1 month hiatus turned to 2 months because of reasons. There was a lot going on. As you may or may not know, in March, I took a job as a background casting director and coordinator, casting, background actors for movies, like when you're in a, busy restaurant or something and there's like other people in the dining room and you've got like your two characters talking, you've got extras in the background, and that's what I was in charge of. And let's just say the experience was not what I thought it was going to be. And yeah, I've got lots of ranting and raving to do about that. But the main reason why I had to take another month off is this job just turned into way more work than it should have been, all because of one person who had a power trip because they had just an itty-bitty little bit of power. I think we've all worked with those kinds of people. And the director being a trust fund baby who couldn't manage their way out of a paper bag, all right? So there was a lot of drums, a lot of stuff went down. But anywho, that turned into so much work, like I was literally putting in like 14, 15-hour days, guys, that it caused me to not be able to work on my channel at all. I had just finished today's case, finished my notes, script, whatever you want to call it, for today's case. And then, yeah, I got this job and yeah, it just took all my time. So through the month of April, in between dealing with a lot of big personal things going on, like the adulting stuff that you have to do, I was also trying to work on content for my channel. And I'm still not as ahead as I'd like to be because I'm going into some really deep, meaty cases in the next few weeks, in the next month. And these are cases that are bare minimum gonna have 2 parts. Probably going to be 3 or 4 parters, honestly. Like, that's just a lot of meaty ones to get into. So that is what I have been doing. That is why I had to take more time off than I wanted. And yeah, but I'm back. I'm here now. And yeah, I think without further ado, let's get into today's case. Let's sort of change our demeanor here. It's nice and happy and I'm excited to be back, anxious to speak with you guys about these cases. Let's now transition to more proper mood here. So today's case was, again, a requested case. You guys throw a lot of meaty cases at me, which is another reason why I'm still working on some. So today's case was requested by Ho-Va. I'm going to assume that's how you pronounce it. H-O, and then it's a separate word, V-A. So Ho-Va. I'm going to assume. Let me know if that's not correct, if you happen to be watching. But Ho-Va went ahead and suggested today's case, which is the tragic, brutal murder of a young college student named Michelle Gardner-Quinn. Have you all heard of this case? I hadn't heard of this case until it was suggested to me. So yeah, doing a, precursory search on this case, I came across it, and yeah, I just wanted to talk about it with you because it's just, I've said this, a million times at this point, like all, true crime, all murder is senseless, but like this one, not only is it especially senseless, it's like especially creepy because it happened in a position that many of us, male and female alike, have been in, where, hey, can I, you have a stranger, hey man, can I, borrow your phone? Or hey man, can I get directions? You go and ask a stranger for help because you assume, oh yeah, they can give me directions. They can, give me a quarter for the payphone, back in the days of payphones, and that's kind of what happened to Michelle here. She was in a situation that so many of us have come across in our lives, and it unfortunately ended poorly for her. And it's, God, man, it's just really freaking sad. Again, I always struggle with the murder cases where people are especially young, not that older people, not that their lives aren't, as important, it's not as tragic, but it's just when they're so young, you know? They didn't get a chance to live their lives. Like, and Michelle, I think she was like 21 or something in today's case. Like, I don't know, man. That's a baby to me. Like, you're still a baby. You're just blossoming into, like, your adult life. You know what I mean? So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this case. Let's talk about Michelle Gardner-Quinn. So, Michelle Gardner-Quinn was born January 28th, 1985. And she was born in Washington, D.C. to parents John Charles Quinn and Diane Gardner-Quinn. Michelle would end up growing up in Arlington, Virginia, right across from the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. She also had two older half-siblings, a sister named Yasmin and a brother named Paul Rassam. Or maybe it was Rassam. You guys know me. I try really hard to pronounce names, but names are especially difficult to pronounce sometimes, right? Especially if people, you know, spell it a certain way, or it doesn't follow sort of like, you know, your stereotypical, like, traditional sort of, like, spelling and pronunciation rules. So I do try with the names, I swear, I really do. Now, I don't know about Paul, but I know Yasmin was 18 years older than her little sister, Michelle. Now, Michelle was a vegan. She loved to read, was described as very introspective, and was independent from a very early age. One of those kids that just sort of hit the ground running, you know, was always very independent, able to take care of herself. Michelle would end up growing up to be an environmentalist. That would be a subject that would be very near and dear to her heart. To her whole life. She cared deeply about climate change, and she was described, quote, as an activist. She didn't sit back and watch the world change. She changed it. And this was a description of Michelle by one of her close friends. It is said Michelle rode her bike everywhere from a very young age, all the way up into her young adulthood. She even started a biker gang when she was young. She loved to snowboard, dabbled in photography, played the cello, and was an avid practitioner of yoga and swimming. Like, Michelle had so many hobbies and talents, y'all. Like, man, sometimes reading about, like, yeah, some of these cases, some of these people, they've done so much. They have so many, like, hobbies and interests. I'm like, man, I'm so jealous. Like, I wish I was like that. Like, Michelle was just full of life and had so many things going for her, man. It is said Michelle had a natural knack for making friends as well. As we'll get into, Michelle had so many friends, guys, and she was so good at making friends, all right, and so good at maintaining connections. She had friends that she had known since, like, elementary school. She was described as, like, soft-spoken, maybe even a little shy when you first met her. But at the same time, she sort of, like, exuded this strong will, you know? Like, she didn't come off as, like, timid or meek. So since, you know, she had a knack for making friends, her social circle was very, very large, as I just said. One friend said that Michelle's magnetism, her beauty, and her accepting nature just drew people to her, you know? Tommy Lang was a close friend of Michelle's. He actually met her while they were in high school. They went to high school together. And they actually dated, but ended up breaking up, but remained, like, really close friends. And coincidentally, Tommy would actually end up spending some time at the same college as Michelle. We'll get into that in just a moment. Tommy talked about his friend Michelle, how he taught her snowboarding. Quote, she was awesome at snowboarding. I remember pushing her to do more things. I taught her how to board slide and do rails. She was great. A goofball on the hill. We would be having snowball fights while going down the trails. Gail Fendley was another person who knew Michelle. She was like a family friend. She had known Michelle for about 10 years, and she met Michelle when her son, Ian Wilson, met Michelle at a summer camp for gifted kids when they were in, like, the 7th, 8th grade. And Michelle and Ian would date on and off all throughout high school and remained, quote, really close. Gail described the whole Gardner-Quinn family as, quote, tight-knit, and described Michelle as, quote, terrific. She's reliable. She's responsible. She was a good student. I can't imagine any problems. She was a good influence on my child, which isn't that great. I mean, I feel like as a parent, especially, like, as your kids get into, like, you know, the teenage years where they're going to start dating and stuff, you're always worried about, like, the wrong kinds of people entering their life, right? Whether it be friend or romantic. And, you know, when you have someone like Michelle, you just didn't have to worry about that. I can only imagine as a parent, like, how reassuring that would be, you know what I mean? Because those are the kinds of people that you want your kids to be with, right? People are going to be a good influence, and Michelle was just a really good influence. She was good people. Now, some articles stated that Michelle and Ian were actually dating at the time of the events of today's case. So not too sure. I saw that in a couple of articles reporting on this case. Another friend named Kate Gladstein or maybe it's Gladstein, who Michelle would meet later in her life, said that Michelle was always good for a laugh. And when you really got her going, she would snort from laughing so hard, so everyone would try to make, Michelle laugh as hard as she could, so she would snort. She described the messy bun hairstyle that Michelle was known for, especially when she was hard at work, gardening or biking or something. Kate would later describe many more memories that she got to have with Michelle. It involved making vegan sushi, doing impromptu yoga sessions, and sharing poetry. So yeah, man, Michelle she was good people, man. She sounds like someone that you would want in your life. So Michelle ended up attending H.B. Woodlawn Secondary Program in Arlington, Virginia. It was an alternative magnet school for K through 12, 6 through 12. And at Woodlawn, they encouraged their students to sort of craft their own educational experience, as it were. And this was a philosophy that apparently Michelle would adhere to for the rest of her academic career. After graduating high school in 2003, she then attended Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland. But she didn't physically stay at the campus for very long. Michelle enrolled in study abroad programs. And so she studied abroad in many, many places, including Brazil, Costa Rica, South Africa, and apparently, among many other things, I just thought this was funny, she studied the behaviors and stuff of giant swamp otters, which I was like, that sounds super interesting to me. In the summer of 2006, Michelle, along with Ian, traveled to New Orleans in order to help volunteer for Hurricane Katrina relief. And for the 2006-2007 school year, her senior year, Michelle actually transferred to the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont. And she transferred there in August of 2006. So she partly decided to transfer here because it allowed her the freedom to individually sort of craft her own major, sort of, as it were. She wanted to combine an environmental studies major with a Latin American studies major, and she was able to make this work at University of Vermont. So even though Michelle would only be at UVM for 6 weeks before the events of today's case, she made a lot of friends while here in her short time and just seemed to blend in seamlessly. She just really took to the area, took to the people, made a lot of friends, even though she was only here for 6 weeks. One of her best friends that she would make at UVM was Julia Martin, who said, quote, "She was my best friend at school. We got really close really fast. We pretty much did everything together." Julia and Michelle had actually met on a university organized backpack / hiking trip, and it was organized for the transfer students who had come in that year. And that is where Michelle met Julia, and she would meet a lot of the friends that she would make while here on this trip. One of those friends was Adam Breer, and he described Michelle as, quote, "a happy, outgoing environmentalist, ready to engage tough problems and not get bogged down in the doom and gloom." And man, is that type of perspective and insight needed today more than ever, am I right? So the weekend of October 6th, 2006 was UVM's family weekend. And of course, parents and family came to the university. It kind of reminded me of like an open school night, coming out, check out the campus that their students are, their children are, doing, what they're doing with school and whatnot. And of course, Michelle's parents joined this family weekend. They came to Burlington to see their daughter, and they would speak later about how they were just sort of amazed at the young woman that she was becoming, they're, seeing their child literally blossom into a young adult, before their eyes. And they were just blown away with, who Michelle was when they came and visited her on campus. John, her father, said, quote, "Suddenly, I realized our child was going to be more than okay. And just those 2 days in Burlington with her. There were special things about her then. A light. I always suspected there was something going on there. I thought it was a candle. I didn't realize that it was a searchlight that was going to attract a lot of people to the way she thought about things, about the world in which she lived, and that she cared passionately about everything in this world." Diane, her mother, added on, quote, "I was astounded at how much she had matured." Her father continued talking about Michelle, quote, "She always said, 'What can I do? What can I do? How can I make the world better?' She knew she had to do it within the construct of our society, but she also knew she was probably going to rewrite the parameters of that construct. I saw that, and I was in awe." That Friday night, October 6th, 2006, Michelle, who was 21 years old, a friend named Dorsey Kilborn, Dorsey's parents, and some other friends, along with, I think, Michelle's parents as well, all went out and dined at a South Burlington sushi restaurant. Yeah, I was confused if Michelle's parents were at this dinner, based on some of the reporting, but I know for a fact Michelle and her friend Dorsey were there. Apparently, Michelle and Dorsey indulged in some sake bombs during dinner. It was Dorsey's 21st birthday, so of course, had to get some drinks. And then after dinner, the girls, along with some other friends, including Tommy, I wasn't sure if he was at dinner or not, but I do know after dinner, Michelle and her friends, Dorsey and Tommy, then left with some more friends, and they were going to go out to celebrate Dorsey's birthday. And they had just, a typical night out, your typical college night out, celebrating a friend's 21st birthday, doing some bar hopping, and just having a wonderful evening. Julia was also there, remember, Julia Martin, and I believe she was like one of the first to call it a night. I think she called it a night early. Dorsey also left the group at one point, and this was to attend a different party that was held in an apartment near the intersection of Pine Street and Main Street, while Michelle, Tommy, and another friend Mike met up with others at a bar called JP's, and they hung out there for a while. Later, Michelle decided to leave the bar and the group because she decided she was going to go meet up with Dorsey. And when she left the bar to go meet up with Dorsey, Tommy was getting ready to head out, and so he left with Michelle and accompanied her as she walked to where Dorsey was going to meet her. Now, of course, Michelle wasn't really familiar with the area, so on her way, she called Dorsey on her cell phone asking for directions. And so as Michelle and Dorsey were talking, Michelle's cell phone battery died. So before Michelle's phone battery died, because, she saw it was dying, and so Dorsey was like, okay, meet me at the ski rack store. I'll be out front, and I'll meet you and take you up to the party. Guessing it was one of those situations where, like, there was a store on the ground level, and then there was, like, apartments above it, So when Michelle then, got cut off from Dorsey because her cell phone died, her and Tommy were standing on Church Street, which was just north of College Street, where the campus was. Now, Tommy offered to walk Michelle to the ski rack store, especially, since her cell phone died and stuff. He's like, can I accompany you? You want me to come with you to the store and meet up with Dorsey? And Michelle just declined the offer. Tommy later said, quote, she was like, you have to work in the morning. Don't worry about it. And so it was at that point that Michelle and Tommy split up, with Tommy heading home and Michelle walking towards the ski rack store to meet up with Dorsey. Now, a few minutes after Tommy had departed from Michelle, it was around 2:15 in the morning, so technically we're on Saturday, October 7th. So as he's walking, he's parted Michelle's company about, 5-10 minutes later, and he gets a phone call on his cell phone from an unknown number. It was an unknown Vermont number. And when, Tommy answered, he was a little surprised to hear Michelle's voice. He's like, whoa, what the heck? Like, this isn't Michelle's number. She said a random guy had lent her his cell phone since her battery died. She was calling Tommy to see, like, hey, can you call Dorsey and ask her to come outside? I'm walking, I'm trying to find her, and I can't see her anywhere. Can you please, have her come outside and give her a call? I'm not sure if Michelle had tried to call Dorsey before this and she didn't pick up, or maybe she didn't know Dorsey's number by heart. Like, man, I know since cell phones, like, I rarely bother to memorize numbers. But, she had called Tommy and asked, like, for him to get in contact with Dorsey. Now, apparently, get this, dude. Get this. So the bitch of it is, a few minutes before Michelle had called Tommy, Dorsey actually was outside the ski rack store looking for Michelle. She had frequently parted from the party to come downstairs and, look for Michelle and trying to keep an eye out for her. So a few minutes before Michelle had called Tommy, and I think had been probably within visual range, Dorsey had stepped back inside. Not just that, she had her cell phone in her jacket pocket, and when she went inside, she took off her jacket and completely forgot about her cell phone, and the cell phone was on vibrate, so it wasn't even ringing. And so Dorsey missed the 10 phone calls that Tommy had placed to her. And this was around, that time period, 2:15 a.m. So yeah, just a few minutes difference, and we probably wouldn't even be talking about this case today. So finally, about 10-15 minutes later, around 2:30 now, after still not being able to meet up with Dorsey and it getting late, Michelle decided, you know what, we'll just meet up tomorrow, it's fine, I'm gonna call it a night. So, using the random guy's cell phone again, she called Tommy back. Now, initially, Tommy missed this call, and I think only missed it by a few seconds. And when he called the number back, a man's voice answered, not Michelle's. Tommy would later say, quote, he said something to the effect of, I guess you want to speak with this beautiful brunette standing next to me. Yeah, weird, right? And apparently, Tommy just replied, like, Yeah. And then Michelle got on the line. She told Tommy that she was going to head back to her dorm room. She had missed Dorsey. She was still with the random guy. And that she was currently walking up Main Street to the dorms. And then they hung up. And unfortunately, tragically, this would be the last phone call that Tommy would ever have with his friend Michelle. He would later say, quote, "She sounded completely fine and normal and exactly the way she did when she left us. There wasn't anything that made me worry or made me suspicious that anything was going on." Michelle would last be seen walking east on Main Street toward UVM at 2:34 a.m. She was wearing her gray peacoat, a green button-up cardigan sweater, a light blue t-shirt, black Converse All-Star low-top sneakers, silver hoop earrings that were adorned with small dangling charms, a wood bead bracelet, bead bracelet, her school ID, which was known as a cat scratch card, and carrying her black Puma purse that had white straps. According to Tommy, quote, "She never made it back to the dorms." Now, let's talk a little bit about this random guy, this random Good Samaritan that lent Michelle his cell phone so she could call Tommy. This random guy was 36-year-old Brian Rooney, and he was inebriated after a night drinking and hanging out and partying with his friends. And unbeknownst to him, video surveillance from Periwinkle's Fine Jewelry Store, which was located on Main Street and owned by Perry Sporn, captured Michelle walking with him at 2:34 a.m. Within 2 hours of these surveillance images, Michelle would unfortunately be dead. So let's talk a little bit more about this random guy, Brian Rooney. So Brian Lee Rooney was born on June 27th, 1970 in Burlington, Vermont. He was the third of 6 children, and his mother was Patty Skinner. Brian's oldest brother is Ricky Rooney, who said Brian was actually their father's favorite. Now, it is said Brian's family never really settled in one place. They were constantly moving around, most specifically in the Northeast Kingdom area, and this was after Ricky and Brian's biological father had abandoned the family. Yeah, can you imagine abandoning your family, let alone your favorite child, which you shouldn't even have? Ricky said of their father, quote, "Our father deserted us. He never wanted anything to do with any of us." Ricky said of their mother, Patty, that she, quote, "did the best she could." Patty would later remarry Brian and Ricky's stepfather, a man named Robert Skinner. And the couple would end up having 3 children of their own, Ricky and Brian's 3 younger half-siblings. And that's really all I know about Brian's upbringing or life, guys. There's not a lot of nitty-gritty details about him. I mean, don't you worry, we've got some stuff that we know about him. But the next thing that I know about Brian is that he eventually marries. He married a woman named Raquel Bullard, and the couple would end up having 3 daughters together. And I'm not sure when they married, but eventually the couple would divorce. Now, let's go into some other facts that we know about Brian, shall we? In 1996, Brian fondled and molested a little girl who was 13. And this is when he lived in St. Johnsbury. He sexually assaulted this little girl later in 1998 when she was 15, and he was living in East Concord. Yeah, nice, right? In 1998, when he assaulted the girl in his home, he had apparently drugged her in order to do it. The girl said that Brian made sexual advances towards her sister as well, and apparently this was a pattern of behavior that Brian had exhibited to this little girl. And as with most of these freaks, right, it wasn't just this one girl that Brian was accused of doing things to. This was apparently a history that he had with little girls. Apparently, the 15-year-old he assaulted in 98, apparently he had tried to incapacitate her other times, but had failed. And he would incapacitate her, or try to, with a chemically soaked rag. A pattern he would repeat with other girls and young women. And she said he often exposed himself to her. And it shouldn't come too much of a shock that Brian also had a history of not being able to keep a stable job, mainly due to his issues with female employees. And again, not sure when they divorced, but I do know in 2000, Raquel Brian's ex-wife, obtained a temporary restraining order against him and stated that she, quote, left Rooney because she was afraid of him. Rooney drugged her many times so he could sexually assault her. She requested a, quote, relief from abuse type of order and said as well, quote, when we were together, he drugged me many times so he could sexually assault me. She said Brian did the same thing to her 15-year-old sister, placing a chemically soaked rag over her sister's face, causing her to pass out, and Brian then sexually assaulted her. Now, I am unclear if Raquel's sister is the 15-year-old that we talked about that he assaulted in 1998. I'm a little unclear because of the way, we report on sexual assault victims, especially if they're minors. I'm unclear if this 15-year-old is the same one that he had assaulted in 98. But either way, this girl, Raquel's sister, the 15-year-old, said that she woke up the next morning and she had like a burning / soreness sensation in her, genital area. And so she was brought to the hospital. I don't know if by Raquel or her other family, but she was brought to the hospital, and turned out she had chemical burns. And they also performed a gynecological exam, and I think that's how they determined she had been assaulted. Raquel was granted this order of protection, and it forbade Brian from coming within 500 feet of Raquel, threatening her or following her. Raquel had also claimed that Brian had threatened to kill her on at least one occasion, so she was granted the order of protection. Now, though these orders of protection are issued under civil law, violating them could still lead to jail time and or fines. And as is apparently common in these specific types of cases, the paperwork that the local police department received in order to kind of enforce this order did not include the allegations or any of Raquel's statements. It just merely details the exact order that police were to enforce. So basically just told them, hey, you got to keep this dude away from this chick, that's pretty much all they received. They didn't have any nitty-gritty details and why she had received this order, why it had been approved. You know what I mean? Now, Brian did end up working construction at some point, and in 2000, Essex County records showed that he was named in a bank foreclosure that was involving property that he and Raquel owned in Gilman, and records on file with the Vermont District Court in Burlington also showed that Brian was charged at least 4 times with driving with a suspended license, with the most recent case happening twice in 2002 alone. And in one of those instances, he was actually charged with disorderly conduct by traffic. So I'm guessing he used his car. I thought that was a weird term. And in both of the 2002 cases, he was found guilty of driving under a suspended license. And I guess disorderly conduct by traffic. That must mean he used his car or something, right? That's what I infer from that. Now, at the time Brian met Michelle, unsure if he was still doing construction work, but he was living in Richmond, Vermont, specifically in Winooski, and he lived across the street from Walt's Game Room, which was owned and operated by John Burton. And he said he would talk to Brian often, as Brian would come in several times a week to have a drink. Yeah, it was like a bar, pool hall / bar area. I wasn't sure if you could gather that from the title. I'm a nerd, so when I heard Walt's Game Room, I was, thinking of a comic shop or a tabletop shop. Brian would also frequently visit his mother and stepfather, who lived in Richmond, and having grown up around here, it is said Brian knew these areas quite well, especially the surrounding area of his parents' property. Now, the night that I ran into Michelle, remember we said he was inebriated after a night of drinking and partying with his friends. Apparently, he had received some sort of large paycheck or something. That was literally all the details that the newspaper said. I have no idea, what it was from or whatever, but just said he was out enjoying a night on the town with his large paycheck with a couple of his friends. One of those friends was Dawn Mortis. And she said at one point, she and her other friend told Brian, hey, we're gonna go home. Do you want us to give you a ride home? We're gonna call it a night. And Brian refused. Didn't want to call it a night just yet. She said, quote, he wasn't ready to leave yet. We left and he stayed downtown. Brian had spent time in the the Irish pub, which was located on Church Street Marketplace. So that is the random guy that Michelle ran into. Of course, right? Just needed to use his cell phone, and she runs into a pedo creep. So the next day on Saturday, October 7th, 2006, Michelle had plans with her parents. They were going to watch the homecoming parade in the afternoon, and then they were going to proceed to dinner. But when Michelle missed the parade, they immediately grew concerned. Her parents were like, wait a minute, this is not right. And so they immediately headed to her dormitory. Diane said, quote, every 15 minutes I would call into the room No answer. I went inside probably 3 times to knock at the door. There was never any answer. And when Michelle wasn't at dinner by 6 p.m., they grew even more concerned and went straight to the police. John said, quote, by 6:30 p.m., we were in a full hunt. So Michelle's parents reported her missing, and her parents and her friends then started looking everywhere for her. Tommy told Michelle's father, John, about the random guy's cell phone number that he had in his phone. So John, of course, called it, right? Makes sense. Brian answered, and in the approximately 2-3 minute conversation that John and Brian had, Brian admitted that he had indeed met Michelle and that she had indeed used his cell phone. He said after she had been done using her cell phone, they parted ways and she hailed a taxi and headed towards the campus. John said nothing seemed suspicious about the short conversation. Everything, seemed on the up and up, and so they hung up. And John started thinking about, what Brian had just told him. He's like, well, Michelle flagging down a stranger for help to use her cell phone, that seems in line with her character. I could see her doing that. But Michelle hailing a taxi, that didn't sound like Michelle at all. He thought that was a little weird, especially because, the campus was just up College Street a ways, and Main Street wasn't that far from College Street, It's a short walk. Diane said, quote, the taxi didn't sound right. John added, quote, she would have just marched up the hill, and she did walk up the hill. We have a videotape to demonstrate that very clearly. Law enforcement immediately treated the case as a missing persons. You know how sometimes, especially if they're young, they'll be like, oh, they probably ran away or something. Apparently, when Michelle's parents explained the situation, and I guess they did some superficial research, they're like, okay, yeah, this is more than likely a missing persons. And so her case was worked on pretty much right away. Rich Long, who was chief of detectives at the Burlington Police Department, said, quote, it was clear to me from the beginning that we had a legitimate missing persons complaint. We knew we had somebody who should not be missing. Some 6 officers would join in the search for Michelle, and this would include officers from the Vermont State Troopers and the FBI. And at one point, they even enlisted the help of the National Guard and had them used their helicopter for an air search for her. So as this search is going on Saturday, right? People are freaking out. Where's Michelle? Where's Michelle? So Tommy decided to call Brian. I'm unclear if Tommy called Brian before or after he gave Michelle's father Brian's number. I'm unclear about that. I just know that at some point that Saturday, as everyone's looking for Michelle, Tommy decides to call Brian's number. Now, some articles reported that Tommy and Brian actually had 2 short separate phone conversations, but we do know that at least in one, they at least had one. And when Brian picked up, Tommy explained the situation, what was going on. And Brian told Tommy that he had left Michelle at the intersection of Main Street and South Union Street. Tommy said, quote, he said he saw her walking up the hill toward UVM. And this may have been in the separate conversation because Brian then proceeded to tell Tommy that he and Michelle had parted ways almost immediately, after she was done using his cell phone, and probably took a cab back to campus. Tommy would later say, quote, he also said he didn't want to sound prejudiced, but there was a group of black people hanging out on the corner. Nice, right, huh, Brian? Not only are you a pedo freak, you're also a racist. Of course. Now, Tommy had forwarded this information, Brian's phone number and the conversation or conversations that he had with them to police. And I'm not sure if this was before or after Tommy's information, but that same day on Saturday, police were quickly alerted to the video surveillance footage that the jewelry store had. Burlington Police Detective Andrew Frisbee had been canvassing stores on Main Street, looking for that, looking if there were any, video surveillance cameras or anything. He saw the one that Periwinkles had and was like, hey, I think we got something. And it seems from the beginning, right? From the beginning, guys, Brian was a suspect. And again, I'm just not sure, when all this information came to the police, but I'm pretty sure all of this avalanche of information about Brian came to the police probably within a day or two, that Saturday and Sunday. So Brian was almost immediately looked at as a person of interest. Detective Long explained how in cases like this, police actually do everything they can to add as many people as they can on the suspect list. And then after they get their list compiled, they then go through and try their hardest to eliminate everyone off that list. And he said, quote, he was a person we could never exclude. Of course, referring to Brian. Now, apparently police interviewed Brian on multiple occasions. And the first interview they had with Brian was actually that Sunday, October 8th. Now, Brian gave a number of stories of how exactly he had come into contact with Michelle. He first said that he had been on Main Street trying to find his friends, and he had first encountered Michelle between Pine and Church Streets. Or I guess I should say the streets between Pine and Church. You know what I mean? Then he changed his story and said, oh, no, actually, Michelle had approached him on Pine Street and had asked to borrow his cell phone. And in yet another story, he said he had, quote, stumbled across Michelle as she was having phone problems and was approaching Church Street. Every time police interviewed Brian, he denied having anything to do with Michelle's disappearance and kept saying that he had separated from her not long after she was done using his cell phone. Detective James Claremont of the Vermont Police Department would say, quote, he advised he separated from Gardner-Quinn at that point and he never saw her again. Rooney denied having any knowledge or involvement in Gardner-Quinn's disappearance. Brian said that after he had separated from Michelle, he went to his car that was at the intersection of Main Street and South Union Street, while Michelle proceeded up Main Street towards UVM. Burlington Detective Ray Nails said of Brian, quote, he's our best witness, so he has to help us out as much as he can. He was very cooperative, very good, very understanding, very polite. Brian also repeatedly denied having any type of sexual contact or any type of intimate relationship or any relationship with Michelle at all. And in one of the interviews that he had with police, he said, quote, hopefully you find her soon and I get cleared. He said police were, quote, barking up the wrong tree. The detective he was speaking with at that moment then told him, quote, I'm just baffled by all this. And Brian just, responded with like, you and me both, man. Yeah, it's such a mystery. But as the days and interviews went on, as did the search for Michelle, Detective Nails noticed that Brian's demeanor and openness towards them changed. He went from being very forward and helpful and direct to being very quiet and evasive. Detective Nails said, quote, I asked again, Brian, you didn't hurt Michelle, did you? And after a beat, he said Brian replied to him, quote, it was a barely audible no. And after giving a number of different explanations as to how exactly he had run into Michelle, Brian then said in one of these interviews, quote, I honestly don't remember what I did that night. Another time, he told investigators, quote, you guys think I'm guilty. And as police dug further and further into Brian and his life and interviewed acquaintances, friends, and family, the sexual assault claims from years and years ago came to light, and Brian's shady past with little girls and young women came to the surface. So this whole week that's now ongoing as we're searching for Michelle, police kept a real close eye on Brian and monitored his movements. Meanwhile, that same Sunday, Michelle's friends, including the ones she had celebrated with that Friday, were still out looking for her, passing out flyers, doing all kinds of interviews with local news, and were just doing everything possible to find their friend. And as this search was going on, apparently Brian phoned Raquel, remember his ex-wife, and said he had been unable to call her for the last few days. And Raquel would later say, quote, I asked him why he wasn't using his cell phone. He said he lost it a week ago, but this confused her because the caller ID showed that he was calling from his cell phone. So that was a little weird to her. So on Monday, October 9th, Michelle's disappearance hit the papers. Her roommate of 6 weeks, Erin DeGraw, gave some little brief interviews about Michelle and the search. She explained how everyone was extremely worried and upset, desperately searching for her. Erin said since, they had only been roommates for 6 weeks, she didn't get a chance to know Michelle too well, but, she did know her a little bit. She said she was easy to get along with. Michelle and her would have talks in their living room. Quote, she's not the type of person who would just disappear. Detective Kim Edwards told the papers, quote, she's out of place with no logical explanation for being out of place. At this point, we do not believe she left of her own free will. Now, when her disappearance initially hit the papers, there were thoughts that at first she could have been a victim of a creeper that was reported earlier that Friday evening. And this was in the area that Michelle was last seen in on Main Street. Apparently some woman was walking along minding her business and some douche, he was in his early 20s or something, rolled down the window and tried to get her to come into the vehicle or something. But this just ended up being some rando creepazoid who had nothing to do with Michelle's case. Now, the initial reports of Michelle's disappearance mentioned Tommy's assertion that Michelle was seen with a random guy whose cell phone she had borrowed. However, in these first initial reports of Michelle's disappearance, we had the first one hit the papers on Monday, and all throughout this next week, there'll be stories about Michelle's disappearance. It was a huge, big deal in the area, right? And at first, with these first articles that came out about it, it was reported, quote, police say the man Gardner-Quinn's friends saw her leaving with is not a suspect in her disappearance. It's always so interesting to me when you're researching these cases, especially when you're going through the old newspaper articles and knowing the overview of the case, it's really interesting to then go and see like newspaper articles and how, the case is initially reported. And I thought that was super interesting that, in these first initial reports of Michelle's disappearance, they were saying that this random guy that she had last been seen with, whose cell phone she had borrowed, was not a suspect, which, I just thought was kind of, I was like, oh, that's kind of like funny because I know from more information that they had suspected Brian from the get-go. I just thought that was interesting. Burlington Police Department Chief Thomas Trimbley even said, quote, investigators have been working around the clock following leads. No specific suspects have been identified. And this was despite this same day, that Monday that this article came out, police searched Brian's red Grand Jeep Cherokee vehicle. So again, I just found that super interesting that, at this point in time, they're hiding what they suspect from the public, which, makes total sense. Apparently, when they searched Brian's vehicle, they found nothing. They found no evidence, physical, forensic, or otherwise, that showed Michelle had ever stepped foot in Brian's vehicle. There was also no visible signs of cleanup, no smell of bleach or cleaning products. In fact, it was reported that there was actually a bunch of junk and random crap strewn about the Jeep. Tommy would later say that police had told him they had interviewed Brian and he was not a suspect. Which, again, it's not just the public that they sometimes got to keep this information from, right? It's actively people involved in the case, right? Like friends and family. Which, again, I get it. That's also why it's important for police to earn a level of trust, right, with the public. So this same day, again, Monday, a lot of stuff happening on Monday. Investigators showed the Gardner-Quinns and Tommy the surveillance footage from Periwinkles. And they wanted, basically wanting them to confirm, hey, can you identify and confirm that that is indeed Michelle? John, of course, immediately recognized his daughter. He said, quote, she was just walking along, talking to a young man. She was gesturing. Knowing Michelle, she was making some sort of point. She was telling him something. And by the next day, on Tuesday, Michelle's story hit national headlines. It was now no longer a local story. It was a national story. Trimbley had shifted gears and told the press that police were, quote, continuing to work leads related to that person, referring to Brian. Over the past 24 hours, we have received a number of helpful leads that have sent the investigation in a specific direction. We're going to focus our investigation on folks who have had contact with her the night in question. Again, just super interesting to see the development of the public information that is released. So that day in Richmond, apparently police also searched Brian's parents' home. Apparently Brian would sometimes stay on this property on a trailer because it had I think a couple acres of property or something. So because, Brian sometimes crashed there, they went ahead and searched it. However, the press, of course, was unaware of whose home this was. I'm not even sure if they knew the address of the home because why couldn't the press just go to public records and see who owned that property? But I'm pretty sure that's all public information, right? But despite his other statements, Trimbley told the press about this home search, quote, no one associated with the Richmond house should be considered suspects. But then said that the police were, quote, continuing to look in that direction very closely. Again, of course, as we know, referring to Brian, who, remember, the public just knows as random guy. By Thursday, police were obviously changing their tune, saying that they could neither rule the random man in or out as a suspect. Deputy Burlington Police Chief Michael Sherling only said to the press that the search was, quote, part of the investigation. This is unlike any other case. We don't know where she is. That same day, John and Diane issued a public plea for any information on Michelle. Diane described her daughter as a, quote, fighter. I think she's resourceful. I think she's creative, and we pray that she's alive. John said Michelle's disappearance was, quote, very, very trying and very painful for the whole family. Quote, I beg of everyone that hears this broadcast, if they know anything at all about where my daughter Michelle is today, or where she might have been on Saturday morning, Friday night, Saturday morning, they tell us instantly. We remain hopeful that we will find her and that she will be returned to us safe and sound. We pray that that will be today. And that same evening, a candlelit vigil was held for Michelle at UVM. Apparently at this time, the general feeling on campus was definitely one of unease, anxiety, especially for the female college students at this point. Remember, no one knew anything. No one didn't know if there was some creep out there abducting college girls and whatnot. This was your stereotypical safe college town, guys. Small area, everyone knows everyone, it's friendly, it's supposed to be safe, you know what I mean? So yeah, people were rightfully they were a little freaked out, especially the young female college students at UVM. Meanwhile, the search for Michelle was ongoing. Every morning at 6:30, Diane would call the police station, see if they had any breaks or news in the case, but, quote, they never did. So by Thursday, October 12th, police straight up came out and said that Brian, who, remember, the public just knows as Random Guy, who was last seen with Michelle, was part of the investigation. Although, again, they did not release Brian's name or state outright that, like, he was a suspect. You know what I mean? They didn't straight up and say, like, oh yeah, this guy whose cell phone she used is a suspect. Tremblay just told the papers, quote, he still is a significant focus because we are not satisfied. We have no evidence at this time that suggests a criminal offense. We're not close to an arrest. He also stated at this time that Brian did have a connection to the Richmond home that they had searched. And at this time, police released the surveillance photos of Michelle and Brian, along with, like, photos of people who walked, like, immediately into the camera's view right after or right before Michelle and Brian, you know, wanting to see if anyone had seen anything. So they released those images to the public, right? And asking, like, hey, did you see this couple, you know, walking down the street? And as the news was broadcasting this, one of Brian's longtime friends, William Welcome, was watching the news with Brian, saw the story about the surveillance photos, and immediately recognized his friend. He said, quote, I asked if that was him. First he said no. Then I said it looked like him, and Brian eventually conceded that it was indeed him. And William also noted how edgy and nervous Brian seemed, not just, like, at this moment as they're having this conversation, but he started looking back on Brian's behavior the last few days, like the last week. And he noticed that, yeah, Brian was very nervous and edgy this whole week. Also during that week, Brian stopped in at his usual haunt, Walt's Game Room, and John, remember the owner who would speak with Brian, asked him why he had seen the police searching Brian's apartment that week. John would later say, quote, he told me he was being interviewed by the police because he was the guy who lent a cell phone to a college girl who was missing. John also noticed cuts on Brian's hands, and when he asked about them, John said, quote, I saw scratches on his hand. He told me he just lent the girl his cell phone and didn't remember anything after that. And finally, on Friday, October 13th, around 1 p.m., Michelle's body would finally be found. It was discovered in Richmond by a couple of hikers. She was found in the crevice of a large rock just over the lip of Huntington Gorge, which was described as a scenic area off of Dugway Road, which was like a dirt road, and this, like, area had not yet been searched. Huntington Gorge was only 6 miles from Brian's parents' home. Apparently this location also served as a very, like, popular / somewhat dangerous swimming hole in the summer. Robert Grondal of Rochester, New Hampshire, was the one who found Michelle's body. He was hiking with his boss when, you know, they hiked past the crevice. Now, at first, they thought the, material that they saw down there, because they saw some sort of, you know, material, they thought it was just, like, garbage, you know, trash. And Robert's boss immediately, like, brushed it off, like, barely even, like, stopped, was like, nah, it's trash, let's just go on. But Robert wasn't wholly convinced. He said, quote, something just didn't look right, so I stopped. I knelt down, and there was a shoe that looked like it was suspended up in the air based on the angle I was looking. He said he gently touched the shoe, and it fell off, revealing Michelle's foot. Quote, then I realized I was looking at a body. Gail Fendley, remember, the family friend, Ian's mom, said, quote, we all just can't believe it's happening. I just can't imagine why someone would want to hurt Michelle. I just don't understand. I just don't understand. Tommy said, quote, she's been in Costa Rica, Brazil, South Africa, in rural working areas with farmers on sustainable development. So yeah, she's been in supposedly much more dangerous places, and Burlington is supposedly so safe, and it's just so shocking that this can happen. Michelle, unfortunately, had been sexually assaulted shortly before her death. She was beaten and strangled until she died. And according to Vermont's chief medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Shapiro, Michelle died while lying on dirty ground and suffered, quote, significant injuries that caused her to have massive internal bleeding in both her head and her neck. These injuries were inflicted anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes before her death. And they did say that she did die quickly. They verified that the condition of her body matched with a body being exposed to the elements for a week. But they were unable to say with scientific certainty that Michelle had indeed been killed where she was found. She had visible severe head injuries. Her hair was matted with blood. Her underwear and pants were not pulled up entirely. They were pulled down below her hips, exposing a portion of her pubic region. Her jeans were unbuttoned, and this had indicated indicated that she had been partially naked when she had been killed and had been partially redressed after her death. And while they were, of course, heartbroken and crushed at the death of their daughter, Michelle's parents expressed gratitude that at least their daughter was found. Diane said, quote, "The real nightmare would have been not to find her. That would have been a torment beyond description." Right? Like, it's bad enough that you have to have a loved one be taken from you in such a brutal, violent, premature way, you know, before their time. But dude, like, I can't imagine not at least being able to have their remains, you know? And on this same day that Michelle's body was found, about a couple hours later, Brian was pulled over and arrested in Hardwick as his home was searched yet again, and he was held without bond at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility that was located in South Burlington. And surprisingly enough, he was not arrested on Michelle's murder. He was initially arrested and charged with those sexual assault allegations stemming from the 1990s. Yeah. On the same day that news broke that Michelle's body was found, they also released the information that her killer was in custody. And finally, Brian was publicly named and identified. So yeah, like I said, police initially charged Brian and arrested him on the charges of sexual assault and lewd and lascivious activity with a child, and they cited that this was stemming from an incident that occurred in the 1990s in Northeast Kingdom County. And that is what they held Brian on as they processed the scene where Michelle was found and worked to build their case to charge Brian with her murder. Brian reportedly told detectives in his interrogation, quote, "That's what scares me. I don't know. I deserve to die if I did something. If I did it, I deserve to die." Now, Ricky immediately jumped to his scumbag brother's defense. He was living in Iowa at this time, and he told the press, quote, "My brother would never hurt a woman." Oh, that's right. He just hurts little girls. He knows how to treat a woman right. You'll never find a better parent. He lives for his kids. He described his brother as a, quote, "devoted parent." And yeah, told the papers how Brian was the father of 3 daughters. He couldn't have done this. He refused to believe that Brian had anything to do with Michelle's murder and didn't believe the child's sexual assault charges either. He said anything could have happened to Michelle after they parted ways. Quote, "He could have left her alone and anything could have happened to her. It's all circumstantial and I don't believe a damn word of it." He said the child's sexual assault charges had no merit and were only now being brought up because police wanted to hold his brother while they worked on building a case against him for Michelle's murder. Quote, "The charges were only brought up because of what he's going through now." He claimed that the victim in the sexual assault charges for the 1990s later admitted that she lied about Brian's assault. And Ricky even called the charges against his brother, quote, "kind of funny." Yeah. I don't think you know your brother all that well, Ricky. Police also revealed to the press at this time that Brian had always been their suspect, or at least a person of interest. They talked about their week-long interviews with him, his, like, increasingly unhelpful behavior, and basically just kind of talked about what we talked about, right? Like, how they had built their case against him by investigating him. That's how they find out about, like, the sexual assault charges and all that. So pretty much recapping for the press what we already know. Tremblay announced, quote, "The investigation takes a significant turn now. It's almost like a new investigation starts." They also asked for the public's help in retracing all of Brian's moves that Friday night, Saturday morning. Burlington Police Lieutenant Kathleen Stubbing told the press, quote, "Our investigation continues to focus on Brian Rooney's actions and whereabouts during the time period of Saturday, October 7th at 2:30 a.m. to mid-morning Monday, October 9th. We strongly urge anyone with relevant information about Brian Rooney to call us." They also asked for the public's help in placing Brian's Jeep in Chittenden County in those early morning hours. Shrilling said, quote, "We are not seeking to locate the vehicle. We know where the vehicle is. We have located and searched it. We are seeking individuals who may have seen that vehicle." Lieutenant Stubbing added on, quote, "It's a complex investigation and there has been an incredible amount of information out there that we are sorting through, and more information comes in on a regular basis that we need to sort through." And after this, police would be very tight-lipped about the investigation. They announced, initial details, like their investigation, how they came, on to Brian as their suspect. But after this initial info dump, they remained very tight-lipped, of course, citing the need to, preserve the case for trial. Quote, "The state is concerned that disclosure would constitute a substantial threat to the interest of effective law enforcement." And this was according to Justin Giron, Jiron. How would you guys pronounce that last name? Giron? by the way, Justin, who was a deputy Chittenden County state's attorney, and he filed requests for court documents related to Brian's trial to be sealed from the public and the press, and that request would be granted. A memorial for Michelle was held on Sunday, the 15th. It was held at UVM's Ira Allen Chapel, where about 900 people showed up to remember her in a community that she had only been in for like 6 weeks, and she had this much of an impact. One of Michelle's professors was Cecilia Danks. She was an assistant professor of environmental studies, and she read excerpts of an essay that Michelle had handed in only 2 days before she was killed. In the essay, Michelle expressed gratitude for being able to study abroad, for her opportunities to travel in Latin America and South Africa, and she wrote about her impulse that she had to explore. An impulse that she said that she had had since she was a child, and she was in her backyard watching a praying mantis. Quote, everything creepy crawly was fascinating to me. She said childhood explorations were the germ of the, quote, strong connection to the natural cycle of creation that she felt as an adult. And she said that led her to dedicating herself to combating what she regarded as a major environmental scourge, climate change. Quote, I believe in upholding reverence for all life. I believe that humanity has a responsibility to the earth and to the life that we share our experiences with. So many toxins have been spewed into the atmosphere as a result of our industrial greed that the climate of our planet is changing at an alarming rate. I believe my connection with the natural world prevents me from sitting back and watching this catastrophe. The reality of climate change is here and now. It is the environmental battle of our generation and generations to come. In honor of all life, I am dedicating myself to preventing this worldwide ecological crisis. It's just so sad and infuriating that someone like Michelle, who knows what she could have done, guys, you know, who had not just this drive, but the intelligence and the charisma to get this issue out in public and have people care. And to have that life snuffed away is just completely fucked, especially when you consider where we're at with climate change today, right? Julia recalled fun times that she had with Michelle, including one where they descended some slippery slope of Mount Mansfield, and it was a rainy day, and it was just filled with laughing and falling on their butts. Erin, remember Michelle's roommate, also spoke, as did Michelle's yoga teacher, Stephanie Kaza, or maybe it's Kaza, and 2 fellow students who were seniors, Carrie Johnson and Erin McKeon, did a yoga dance routine in Michelle's memory as Stephanie recited poetry and spoke about the impact that Michelle had had. Carrie and Erin were actually student instructors of a class that Michelle had taken at UVM called Yoga Environmental Philosophy. Doesn't that sound absolutely fascinating? I was wait, what the hell? What is that? I want to take that class. That sounds interesting. A plaque was eventually made and adorned on the spot where Michelle's body was found. It was an oval-shaped plaque with raised gold lettering on a black background, and it just simply reads, Michelle, we love you. On Monday, October 16th, Brian pled not guilty in Vermont District Court in St. Johnsbury to 1 count of sexual assault on a victim younger than 16 and not guilty to 1 count of lewd and lascivious conduct with a child. And he was represented by David Slay, a private practice defense lawyer who acted as a court-appointed attorney in high-profile cases. Slay asked for a $50,000 bail for Brian, saying that Brian's family ties were enough to ensure that he wouldn't leave. Assistant Vermont Attorney General Matthew Levine argued for a $250,000 bail, arguing that Brian was indeed a flight risk regardless of his family connections. Judge Kathleen Manley finally set Brian's bond at $150,000. For the sexual assault charges alone, Brian was facing up to 35 years in prison. Some of the details that were released to the public after his court appearances, because remember the court documents were pretty much sealed, but there were some minute details that were leaked to the public or that the public was aware of, that the press was aware of. It included the details that Brian used a chemically soaked rag to incapacitate his victims. Slay then, of course, because he's an attorney and this is his job, tried to get the charges dropped altogether, saying that there was insufficient probable cause to support them. Quote, if a report was made prior to October 14th, 2000, at least one, if not both of these charges are time-barred by the statute of limitations, with the statute being 6 years. He argued that Raquel's request for a protective order order should count as the beginning of this report. He also questioned why these sexual assault charges that were almost 10 years old were now being filed and prosecuted, and described them as a, quote, peremptory strike by police investigating Michelle's murder. Quote, evidently, the charges weren't of enough concern for anyone to bring forward, but they're convenient at this point. They want to detain him now, so it's a convenient vehicle, referring, of course, to Brian being held as they worked Michelle's murder case to charge him with. Levine denied Slay's assertions and reiterated how the sexual assault charges had come about and been filed because the detectives investigating Michelle's disappearance stumbled upon them. They came across them. Quote, we have an individual who is preying upon younger and weaker victims. Police also stated that the child in the 2000 protective order that Raquel had filed was a relative of Raquel's. So that's why I was like, I guess it was Raquel's, relative or sister, whoever, that Brian had assaulted in 96 and 98, I guess. That's why I'm saying it this way, because I don't have verifiable proof, because, the way they report on sexual assault victims, especially if they're minors, they're not going to name them or give, any type of facts about them. You know what I mean? Levine argued that Raquel's protection order, that when she requested it, no, the statute of limitations should not have started when she filed her report, because it was her young relative who was named as the sexual assault victim. Quote, there was no specific report of these incidents to a law enforcement officer, and the request for a protective order was filed by the woman, not her relative, who is the alleged victim in the case. That too invalidates Slay's argument. It has got to be from the victim herself. And remember, at this point, Brian had still not been charged with Michelle's murder. However, get this, on Thursday, October 19th, Brian was hit with more charges. They were additional charges out of Chittenden County and the Northeast Kingdom with aggravated sexual assault and initiating a felony. He was represented by William Norfolk for these specific charges, and he was a public defender who was a substitute for Slay. So I was unclear if they were working together or what. The papers just said he was a substitute for Slay for these particular charges. These new charges involved an old girlfriend of Brian's, who was only identified as AS. Her and Brian dated for about 3 years, beginning when she was only 17 years old and he was 31. Yeah. Gross. The affidavits for this stated that Brian routinely sexually assaulted AS while they were in bed and sometimes while she was asleep. He also continuously forced her to engage in sexual activity that she was not comfortable with, such as being on video and photographs. And when she lived with him in Underhill, on more than one occasion, she said she woke up to the smell of, quote, starter fluid. One time, she found a can under the bed they shared, found a can in the living room, and found a can in a closet that Brian normally kept locked up. And, remember when Brian's parents' home was searched? Well, when investigators searched the home, they found just hundreds and hundreds of photographs and videos of naked women. One of these videos was labeled AS. This video showed a woman lying on a bed, making no movements, as she was being sexually assaulted by Brian. Now, after these new charges, Brian was then ordered held without bail at all and was sent to the Northwest State Correctional Facility located in St. Albans Town. And according to the same affidavits, when AS was told that Brian had actually used the same method, with the chemically soaked rag to incapacitate women and sexually assault them, when the AS was told this information, it just really spooked her, knowing that he had done this to multiple women. And she was upset, muttering oh my God, before she was able to tell of her experiences with Brian. In November of 2005, I believe this was after they had broken up, AS was told that Brian had come into a convenience store located in Essex and asked the clerk there if they knew anyone who would be willing to kill her. 2 other women who were there also said that they heard Brian say this. Finally, on October 25th, Brian was charged with Michelle's murder, specifically aggravated murder, to which, of course, he also pled not guilty. Now, aggravated murder is the most serious murder charge in the state of Vermont, and it can only be brought up and charged in the state if some other violation, in Michelle's case, the sexual assault, also occurred at the same time. Levine tried to get a court order demanding samples of Brian's DNA for testing, and Judge Michael Cuppersmith granted this request. He ordered Brian to report to Fletcher Allen Healthcare Center in Burlington to give his DNA, but Slay countered with his own request to block the judge's order, stating it, quote, does not adequately state the grounds to suspect Brian, quote, has committed any offense. So a hearing was then held to rule whether Brian did have to submit to DNA testing. In the hearing, the prosecution was represented by Nicole Anderson, and it was ultimately ruled, of course, Brian did have to submit to DNA testing. And again, I'm sure his lawyer knew he wasn't going to win this, but anything to draw out the case, right? After they got his DNA, prosecutors announced that they had identified Brian's DNA, his semen, on/in Michelle's body. So this, of course, was going to be a huge part of their case. The tests put the odds of the semen belonging to anyone else other than Brian as 1 in 240 quintillion. His semen matched a profile from his blood, I'm guessing like the blood that they got through the court order. And I guess they'd also found a drop of blood on his pants or something. So yeah, they were just like, yeah, we've got DNA, right? That's a big hurdle to get over. But Slay just announced that they were going to attack the DNA evidence. Quote, "We've already retained consultants. We identified that at the outset as critical, and we're working diligently on that. We intend to contest the state's evidence with all the vigor we can muster." He announced that he was going to question anyone and everyone who handled that DNA, from the crime scene investigators all the way to the lab. The lab being Vermont Forensic Laboratory, located in Waterbury. He also was going to request documentation and records from that laboratory to how often do your machines give false positives or false negatives? How often do you guys screw up? Basically wanting to attack any type of credibility, right? And apparently the public shouldn't have even been aware of what was going on with this DNA testing. Slay had accidentally given an interview to Associated Press, AP, where he talked about the DNA information in his interview, and I think that's how the public found out about this information. He assumed that this information was fair game. He didn't know that he wasn't allowed to talk about it. And of course, the prosecution just refused to confirm or deny what Slay had mistakenly said. Quote, "I'm not allowed to talk about the results," is all the prosecutors would say. In December, John and Diane, along with UVM, started a scholarship fund in memory of Michelle. Money from the fund would benefit incoming seniors who studied the same field as Michelle, environmental studies. Her parents wrote, quote, "We're working with the development office with an eye toward making the fund a permanent endowment." When they first announced the scholarship, it had about $17,000. And her family also started a non-profit organization in Michelle's memory, Michelle's Earth Foundation, and it aimed to advance environmental education for young people and help create a healthy natural habitat. Her friend, Julia, said of the nonprofit, quote, "This is a way of bringing her memory back, to carry on what she would have wanted." And one of the things the foundation encouraged was small little acts, picking up a piece of trash, planting a tree, Their slogan was, "Small actions equal big change." John spoke about how important it was to them to keep Michelle's memory alive, especially with what she stood for in regards to the environment. Quote, "She spent 21 years getting there. Of course, we're left with the question, what could she have done with another 21? Well, I figure I'm good for another 21. I'll only be 87 or something by then, but by God, maybe that's part of the process. And that's why she's still alive. Because we're still alive. Because her parents are still alive. We're all trying to do the things she said you really ought to do, because I'm going to do them." And on January 28th, 2007, on what would have been Michelle's 22nd birthday, family and friends of Michelle asked people to remember her by lighting a candle and placing it in their window. There was a candlelight vigil held on the UVM green in memory of her birthday. And they said at the vigil, quote, "In loving memory of Michelle, we hope to fill the corners of the world with joy and light on her birthday." In February, going back to the shitbag Brian, it was determined that Brian would answer the sexual assault charges first. I think the sexual assault charges stemming from the 90s, not the sexual assault charges stemming from AS. Judge Coppersmith said that the case for Michelle's murder and sexual assault and the sexual assault case would move forward on a parallel track, with attorneys preparing kind of for both at the same time, but with, again, the sexual assault charges coming first. Prosecutors were led by Chittenden County Deputy State's Attorney Rosemary Grotkowski, who said that these sexual assault charges happened prior to Michelle's murder. The victim in that case was alive and willing and able and anxious to, get Brian charged. Quote, "She wants this case tried as quickly as possible." Slay stated that he was afraid that this order was going to make it harder to defend Brian in Michelle's murder case, and that trying the sexual assault charges first transformed that case into, quote, "the locomotive rather than the caboose." And later that month, the sexual assault charges were upgraded to aggravated sexual assault with injury. And like we said, they would charge those charges first. Then they would try the sexual assault charges involving AS. and then they would finally try Brian for Michelle's murder. Now, in the sexual assault case involving AS, Brian was represented by defense attorney Lauren Duckman, who was one of the state's top public defenders, and had actually been an attorney for numerous high-profile cases. In April 2007, in a hearing that was pretty much to touch base to see where everyone was with the case, Duckman said that he was behind because of the hundreds and hundreds of pornography that he had to go through that they had found at Brian's parents' home. There were 30 videotapes in all, among other media. Duckman told the court, quote, "There are hours and hours and hours of videos of very explicit sexual conduct, and in a variety of formats. Quote, Super 8, video, DVD, still photos, boxes of tapes and CDs. There's every kind of picture, there's movies, there's video, there's stuff that was recorded to CD. You've got to get up and walk around to take a couple deep breaths." He said among the pornography was some commercial stuff, but it was just sort of time consuming going through all of this, you know? And when the judge suggested like, hey, maybe you should hire someone to go through it, Duckman responded, quote, "I'm not sure you can hire someone to look at these." He said that he felt he had an obligation to view them all, and said there were easily, quote, hundreds and hundreds of hours of video. He said there were also recordings of TV shows, movies, family gatherings. Quote, "They're only relying on a couple of the tapes. There is a small amount of what they say make out the charges against this guy," referring, of course, to the video with AS, possibly others. Duckman said that he had to go through the tapes to kind of get a sort of snapshot of Brian and AS's relationship, you know, like what was their dynamic and to put their relationship and their activities in context. And I think there might have been like other videos of them engaged maybe in sexual conduct too, because he said, quote, "They had a real relationship, a part of which was this kind of conduct between the two of them. They were having a regular life. I've got to discover who they were and in what kind of context that might have occurred." Now, the video in question of the assault on AS allegedly totaled 16 minutes and 51 seconds in 2 separate recordings. And according to affidavits, police viewed, quote, "at least 8 additional incidents in which a man appears to assault a woman who seems unconscious." In July of 2007, Michelle's essay that was read at her memorial service, remember we talked a little bit about it, it was made into a 1-minute, like, short / video essay thing. And it involved some pretty famous actors. So the essay that Michelle had written only 2 days before her murder sort of went on to have a little life of its own after it had been read at her memorial. So it was published in one of UVM's magazines, and the son of producer-filmmaker Damon Kayson, who attended UVM with Michelle but did not know her, read the article about it and informed his father, who was actually one of the producers of Live Earth, which was a worldwide concert aimed at raising awareness about climate change. And when Damon read it for himself, he then used his contacts to get celebrities such as Goldie Hawn, Kate Hudson, Meg Ryan, Sheryl Crow, Emily Proctor, Tipper Gore, and then Duchess of York, Sarah Ferguson, all to recite a little piece of Michelle's essay on video. This video was, like a minute long, had all these celebrities like reading a sentence or 2 of her essay, and they premiered this video at the Live Earth event and then later posted it to YouTube. The video ended with Diane saying, quote, "And I believe that my daughter can still change the world." The Gardner-Quinns were still collecting money for the scholarship at this point. At this point, they were up to $55,000. And if the total reached another $60,000 by the end of that year, it would push the figure above the $100,000 threshold, which is what is needed for a scholarship to be a permanent endowment. And I'm so mad at myself, I actually forgot to check if they did reach the permanent endowment. I forgot to totally check. In September, in a reversal of what was originally supposed to happen, the state announced that they were actually going to try Brian for Michelle's murder first. Slay stated, again, what the defense was going to be, attacking the credibility of the DNA evidence. It was going to raise concerns about certain jury selection, pretty much everything that you expect the defense to do, right? Judge Cuppersmith during this time ended up transferring to another area. He transferred from Burlington to St. Albans. This was part of some sort of normal judicial rotation, but he decided to still keep presiding over Brian's case, even though he moved jurisdictions. Slay announced that they were also going to seek to omit some of those incriminating statements that Brian made to police, claiming that his rights had been violated in all of those statements and during those interrogations. He accused the police of ignoring Brian's calls for an attorney and failed to inform him of his rights. Slay said in his motion, quote, "Mr. Rooney's environment was completely dominated by the police. their constant and close supervision, incessant interrogation, and accusation gave defendant no real alternative but to accede to their persistence. His will was effectively overborne by the circumstances created by the police tactics. The prosecution, led by Chittenden County State Prosecutor Brooks MacArthur, there was like 3 or 4 prosecutors. I've named it. We've had Grakowski, and now we've got MacArthur, and we have Levine. There was a lot of prosecutors involved in this. But MacArthur countered that Brian was always free to leave these interviews. He was not under arrest at that time when they interviewed him, and he could have left at any time. He didn't even have to talk to the police. He even said that there were times where Brian would approach the investigators and initiate conversations with them. Quote, during the period of time defendant claims he was in custody, he was in fact free to move about unrestrained, free to cease communicating with the police, and free to refuse to answer any police question. A 5-day hearing was held in January of 2008 to determine whether those interviews, and especially that interrogation that Brian had with police, was admissible in court. Slay questioned Detective Nails and Detective Sean Burke, who both admitted that they had initiated conversations with Brian, some of them short, some as long as lasting as 15 minutes. And this was after Brian had already hired a defense attorney, Douglas Kalin. MacArthur argued that since Brian wasn't under arrest or charged, didn't leave, didn't demand his attorney, or make any other move to leave, all the conversations that Brian had had with detectives and police should be admissible. And we've already talked a little bit about some of those incriminating statements. Some of the other statements that Brian had told police was, quote, I don't know what happened. I can't remember. There was an interrogation and polygraph session that happened on October 11th, and that lasted for 5 hours. The polygraph was ultimately not conducted, and in this interrogation, Brian requested his attorney 27 to 37 different times, and detectives ignored every single request. On one occasion, they even prevented Brian from leaving the room to go speak with his mother out in the hall, and there were also 5 times when Brian attempted to stand up and leave the room, but he was prevented from doing so by detectives, and he would just say, quote, I've been here long enough, I want to do this tomorrow. I've had a stressful day. Now, the first 4 times, the detectives managed to talk Brian down and get him to sit down, but the 5th time, when that wasn't working, Vermont State Police Detective Sergeant James Claremont then resorted to threats, telling Brian, quote, we're not done with you. When we find the body, you're going to be in trouble. You know she's not coming home. You're upset because you know it's the truth. Kind of like that stereotypical interrogation, bad cop mode. In another interview that had been conducted on October 12th, so remember, the day before Michelle would be found, this interview was conducted at Brian's apartment, and in it, Brian told Vermont State Police Detective Ed Tuig and Burlington Police Detective Sergeant Chris Carlson, quote, I'm an emotional wreck. And this was as the detectives were trying to push him to give him more information about what he knew about Michelle's disappearance. Brian just said, quote, I think she said something about getting a cab. I don't really know. He said he had awoken with a major hangover that day. Quote, I was in bad shape. I tried to lay down and watch TV, but I still couldn't sleep. The media at this time was also seeking public access to all of the video and audio recordings of Brian's interviews with police, which the judge denied, sealing them, at least until after the trial. In the end, Judge Cuppersmith ruled in March of 2008 that most of Brian's statements to police were admissible in court. He did rule that the last 25 minutes of a 5-hour interrogation with Brian was inadmissible. Part of that omitted portion included that statement that Brian said that if he did it, he deserved to die. And due to the media's interest in the case, Slay, of course, filed motions for a change of venue, citing it was going to be nearly impossible to find an impartial jury. In April of 2008, the judge agreed and ruled that Brian's trial would be held in Rutland, 65 miles away. He cited 4 main reasons for moving Brian's trial. 1, portrayals of Michelle in media have been, quote, particularly personal and sympathetic, which made it likely that Chittenden County residents, quote, feel a great affinity with her. 2, coverage of the case had been described in massive detail, including evidence that they had against Brian. Media coverage had included details of Brian's past misconduct. And he said the 4th reason was because news accounts, I just thought this was funny, that news accounts have shown Brian in a, quote, unflattering manner, such as by publishing photos in which, quote, he has commonly been portrayed as scowling or sneering. Maybe that's just his ugly face. You ever stop to think about that? I thought that was such a stupid reason. Because yeah, when I was looking up articles about this case and looking at photos, I was like, God, dude, he's You know, that's just what he looks like. You just want to punch him, you know? And it's like, yeah, dude, that's not the media's fault. That's just his ugly face. And that's just the ugly sneer that he has, you know? In October of 2007, Duckman, who remember was representing Brian in the sexual assault case with AS, was promptly fired from the public defender's office, with Defender General Matthew Valero allegedly telling Duckman that it was due to budgetary reasons. And Duckman just told the press, quote, he said it was not performance reasons. I don't have reason to believe him or not believe him. The rug got pulled out from under me and indirectly from the system and from my clients. I still love the system and especially all my clients. On the 1-year anniversary of Michelle's murder, a bunch of UVM students, including some of Michelle's teachers and John, her father, walked the same path that Michelle walked that fateful night. John said, quote, there's a great difficulty in this, but a great joy at the same time. I've seen a videotape of Michelle walking up this street right here. Those are the last images I have of her, and this walk evokes those feelings very strongly. But at the same time, we're doing this not just to remember her, but also to say, we love Burlington. We need to make sure it is a safe place for our young people. We need to make sure it stays a green and beautiful place as Michelle wanted. Cecilia, Michelle's professor, said of the walking vigil, quote, after her death, I really felt the need to rededicate myself in my work with the environment because she was so committed to it. So I think taking this walk that she couldn't complete is symbolic of us doing the environmental work she didn't have the chance to complete. And a year and a half after her murder, another project in Michelle's name and memory was again underway. Volunteers with the Michelle's Earth Foundation were going to travel to New Orleans and plant sunflowers in Michelle's honor. They chose sunflowers because they remove lead from contaminated soil, along with, beautifying the area. They said, quote, we think that her spirit is with us and we're trying to do her work. It gives us a future. It gives us something to try to focus on. Sunflowers are survivors and they are bringing sunshine back to that city. In the same way, we're using them to bring ourselves back around. And this was according to Gail, Ian's mother. And speaking of Ian, he had already apparently traveled to New Orleans at this time and had planted yellow blooms all over the city in Michelle's honor. Apparently he had a really hard time after her death. Also kind of sad at this time, most of Michelle's friend circles at UVM was pretty scattered. Dorsey had transferred to a university in Connecticut pretty much right after the murder. She just couldn't be in Vermont anymore. Tommy dropped out and moved to Portland, Oregon, and found work as a machinist. And Erin, remember her roommate, transferred to a school in New York. Julia, at this point, was the only one of Michelle's circles to still be at UVM. And in April of 2008, before his trial was set to begin, Brian tried to fire Slay, his attorney. We've seen this song and dance before, don't we? Where they try to fire their attorney to stretch out their case. That's what Brian wanted to do. He was claiming that he had not been allowed to assist in his own defense. He wrote, quote, I have legit concerns. I want to make sure my rights are protected 100% to the fullest. Because I haven't had a chance to review everything for trial, I feel the matter is being rushed. I've had limited involvement in my case. He accused Slay of failing to share legal paperwork with him, maintaining open communication with him, or listen to his suggestions for his upcoming trials or defense. He was also upset that Slay would not allow him to address the judge in open court. Quote, I feel from the beginning that obviously I've been railroaded by the system. I haven't had a chance to really prepare for this today, this hearing, because it was scheduled in an immediate fashion. The judge, of course, found Brian's complaints to not really have merit, saying addressing the judge in court, filing paperwork, devising appeal strategies, defense strategies. That was all the job of the lawyer. Not Brian. Quote, so far, I haven't heard anything of significance. Mr. Slay is one of the top criminal defense lawyers in the state. He is prepared, he is thorough, and he is aggressive. And Brian just responded, quote, one of my concerns is, and it's not Mr. Slay's fault, I don't believe, is that the lack of involvement might be brought on by pressure from the court to get things done in a speedy manner. And he's got other cases to work on, and he can't give his undivided attention. And the judge just responded, quote, he's ready to go on trial. I am not willing to let this fester. We are ready to go to trial May 13th. The attorneys on both sides are ready. I do not want to delay this. The judge gave Slay and Brian 10 days to work out their issues, and if he had to, he would appoint a different attorney to Brian, and then he would make sure that attorney had 60 days to do nothing but prepare for the trial. The judge was really determined not to allow Brian to drag this out. So Slay and Brian ended up working out, but then get this. Then Brian wanted Judge Cuppersmith to recuse himself from the case. He wrote, quote, the defense doesn't stand a chance for a fair trial or to have any motions that have a legit foundation granted as long as the cases against me are in your control. He complained about the judge ruling that most of his incriminating statements were admissible in court. He was mad about that. Cuppersmith, of course, refused to recuse himself. And it was then up to the administrator judge for Vermont trial courts, Amy Davenport, to rule whether Cuppersmith had to recuse himself. In the end, of course, she found Brian's complaints without merit. Quote, "To show bias, the litigant must show that an adverse ruling was improperly motivated. That is, the defendant must show not the adversity of the ruling, but that the adversity resulted from the trial judge's personal ill will or favoritism of a party. There is no demonstration here of the kind of personal ill will that would justify disqualification." But then, get this, right after this ruling, Slay requested to recuse himself from the case. So first Brian was trying to get Slay fired. Then he tried to get Judge Cuppersmith fired, and now Slay was like, bro, I don't even want to do this anymore. He was saying that Brian was insistent on acting as his own attorney, filing his own motions. Brian had apparently filed his own appeal regarding Cuppersmith's ruling that his incriminating statements were admissible. Slay had refused to appeal this because if Brian were to be convicted, this could lay the grounds for an appeal to the state Supreme Court. But Brian, thinking he was an attorney, wanted his appeal now, before his trial, and said that since Slay wouldn't do it or file the motion, that he would do it, saying his, quote, "specific request to appeal the denial of the motion to suppress to the Vermont Supreme Court when unheeded and unanswered." Slay wrote, quote, "Defendant is apparently still dissatisfied with my efforts on his behalf and is now actively seeking to represent himself. There has been an irrevocable breach of the attorney-client relationship. I cannot fulfill my professional obligations to defendant under the instant circumstances." The judge just said that short of extraordinary circumstances, Slay would just have to tough it out. There was a, quote, prickly exchange between Slay, Judge Cuppersmith, and Brian at a hearing that was held to see if Slay could recuse himself, and this hearing was held on May 1st. Brian complained, just how fast everything was moving, and never said anything negative about Slay. Quote, "I haven't had time to resolve issues that I've had. I've been rushed into court dates and not allowed time to prepare. I've been backed into a corner and been forced to make decisions that could be detrimental to my defense, and the damage could be irreversible. I'm not trying to employ stall tactics. I feel for her," referring to Michelle, "and her family, and I pray for her every day." And Slay just kept refusing the judge's request that he come up to the stand and testify. And Slay also refused to state outright in open court that the attorney-client relationship was indeed severed. And Cuppersmith finally just told him, quote, "I need evidence, Mr. Slay. I'm not considering this without evidence. I'm denying Mr. Slay's motion for lack of sufficient cause." And with that, Brian's trial finally began with jury selection on May 13th, 2008, with Slay, of course, still representing Brian, who at this point been moved to the Marble Valley Regional Correctional Facility in Rutland. Rosemary Grodkowski, Brooks MacArthur, and Matthew Levine were all the prosecution representing the state, as we said earlier, and the strategies of each side were pretty much what we've been discussing thus far. Prosecution relying heavily on that small sample of DNA that matched Brian, and the defense attacking the credibility of that evidence. In their opening statements, the state laid out their theory of what happened to Michelle that night. They believed that Brian abducted Michelle from where they met, drove her to the gorge that was near his parents' home, assaulted, beat, and killed her, all in one fatal attack. And the prosecution ended up calling 25 witnesses, while the defense, get this, presented its entire case in only 18 minutes and only called 2 witnesses: Brian's mother and stepfather, Patty and Robert Skinner. They both testified that they saw their son asleep on the couch in their living room on the morning that Michelle disappeared. Robert said that he saw Brian on the couch sometime between 4:30 a.m. and 4:45 a.m., and Patty testified that she saw her son sleeping on the couch at 7 a.m. But MacArthur was able to get them to admit on stand that they didn't know when Brian had come home. Brian could have literally just laid down 5 minutes before Robert came into the living room and saw him, The prosecution was putting Michelle's time of death somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m. And on Thursday, May 22nd, 2008, after slightly more than 6 hours of deliberation, at 5:45 p.m., the jury found Brian guilty on all charges. On the way out of the courtroom, Michelle's parents made one last statement to the public that said, quote, "Good afternoon." And it is a good afternoon, isn't it? "We're going to have one very brief thing to say at this time, and then we'd like to go away." Diane said, quote, "Michelle has not been with us for 20 months as a living person, but her living spirit has been with us every day, and her living spirit can be seen in all the good works that are being done in her name. Justice works once in a while. And about 2 weeks later, on June 5th, Slay filed motions requesting a new trial for Brian, beginning the appeals process. And this was despite the fact that Brian had yet to be formally sentenced. Slay was claiming that the instructions given to the jury were flawed, and he was also requesting to interview one of the jurors, Randy Shotteron? I hope I'm saying his last name right, but Randy, in a deposition, saying that he needed to interview Randy in order to prove that a new trial was necessary. And the prosecution quickly filed their own motions to prevent any juror from being deposed. Apparently there's like a Vermont law that strictly prohibits this. Apparently Randy had been one of only 3 jurors who had given interviews to the press about, how they had come to their verdict. And in the interview, Randy talked about how they were 100% certain that Brian had sexually assaulted Michelle because of the DNA evidence, but they needed more time to decide that he had also killed her. And Slay said in his motion that these remarks from Randy, quote, revealed that the jury considered the very notion that someone else could have killed Michelle. In Slay's filing, he said the judge violated Brian's rights when he refused to let the jury convict on lesser charges, such as second-degree murder or sexual assault or something. He argued that the jury could have determined that Brian sexually assaulted Michelle but didn't kill her, or possibly even vice versa, citing the fact that the sexual assault happened about 30 minutes prior to her death. Slay said in his motion, quote, defendant will seek a new trial based upon the court's failure to charge the jury on the requested lesser included offenses. The failure to do so invaded the panel's fact-finding authority. Now at trial, prosecutors had fought for an all-or-nothing approach. Convict Brian of aggravated murder or let him go free. Levine had argued that it was illogical and irrational for the jury to think that, Brian killed her but didn't sexually assault her or vice versa. That was just illogical. The judge agreed, but did note that this issue right here was going to be central to Brian's appeal. Quote, the Vermont Supreme Court will tell us all whether that is a correct decision or not. And in the end, Judge Coppersmith ruled that Slay could not depose Randy, and he continued the gag order for the case as well. Something which a lot of people found quite odd since Brian had already been found guilty, but maybe because Slay was already initiating the appeals process, he decided to extend the gag order. I'm not sure. But that didn't stop Slay from still trying to fight for a new trial for Brian, or just an outright acquittal, arguing that the state did not prove that Brian both sexually assaulted and murdered Michelle. Brian then filed his own motions in July, citing Judge Coppersmith of bias. Quote, a reasonable and disinterested observer could conclude that the court disfavored the defense during the trial. The court's demeanor, manner of ruling, comments, and reactions to evidence, defense counsel, and the defense theory of the case seemed to convey a message to the jury that the court favored the prosecution. The court at times appeared hostile, sarcastic, mean-spirited, and demeaning to the defense, while appearing amicable, helpful, and conciliatory to the prosecution. The defendant was thereby deprived of his right to a fair and impartial trial. Brian was also contending that, again, Judge Coppersmith should recuse himself from the case, arguing what he did before, that the judge was biased and who was mean to him. And now, apparently, until all these issues got sorted, Brian could not officially be sentenced. Finally, in September of that year, a hearing was scheduled to officially sentence him. However, Brian and his family refused to participate in some sort of court-mandated investigation. It's called the Corrections Department Review, and it's described as a pre-sentencing investigation. And, as you can guess, it's designed to help craft appropriate sentences. It's conducted by probation and parole officers, and, as you can imagine, right, they interview family, friends, victims, those related to victims, and trying to get, all sides to see, were there, circumstances in the convicted's past that could explain, you know what I mean? But Brian's family refused to participate in this at all. Now, when he had been convicted in May, Slay sought to just outright cancel this pre-sentencing investigation, saying it's not needed because aggravated murder has a mandatory sentence anyway. And, the prosecution didn't argue because as far as they concerned, they didn't care what was in Brian's past. But Judge Coppersmith ruled for the investigation to proceed anyway because the state Supreme Court might throw out a part of Brian's conviction. Remember, due to the earlier mentioned jury instruction actions. Cuppersmith wrote, quote, "The Vermont Supreme Court may find error in this decision." So that was another reason why I was like, you know what, let's just go ahead and just have it done to have it done. Because if this were to happen, a whole new sentencing hearing would have to be held for Brian, and that investigation would be done anyway. Now, it should be noted, it was Brian's right to refuse to participate in this pre-sentencing investigation. He didn't have to participate. According to Jacqueline Kotkin, the Probation and Parole Office's director, quote, "Convicts are free to refuse. It is the defendant's right, kind of like the defendant's right not to testify." And later that month, Judge Coppersmith officially ruled and rejected Slay's request for a new trial and rejected his request to vacate the sentence entirely, of course. He pretty much rejected everything Slay had argued. Quote, "No rational jury could find that the sexual assault and murder did not occur contemporaneously or that they were not committed by the same person." And then, a little over a week before he was due to be officially sentenced, Brian fired Slay. He threatened to boycott the sentencing hearing and had not attended any of these appeals hearings and stuff that he had because he wasn't allowed to wear civilian clothing. The judge had ruled bro, there's no bias against you. You're already convicted. So no, you don't have a right to be in civilian clothing. And Brian didn't like this. So he was like, fine, I just won't go to these hearings. Basically a petulant child. The Defender General's office then assigned Daniel McGuire to Brian's case, who, like Slay, was normally a private practice defense attorney. But even still, Brian did the same old, filing his own paperwork, filing his own motions, ignoring his attorney. He wrote that he planned on boycotting the sentencing hearing because he saw it as pointless since his crime had a mandatory sentence anyway. And he thought it was just unconstitutional. Quote, "Defendant will not voluntarily appear at the sentencing hearing for the mandatory sentence of life without parole as the sentence is illegal, unlawful, and in violation of his right to due process of law." But Cuppersmith smacked that right down, pointing out that not only did Brian not have a right to boycott his own sentencing hearing, but that others' rights, not just Brian's, were at stake. Quote, "The victim of an offense has the right to be present at sentencing. The court believes that it was the intent of the legislature to permit victims of crimes to express their views not simply to the court or to the public, but to the perpetrator of the crime as well. It is for this reason that defendant's appearance at sentencing is necessary and proper." And he then ordered the jailers to physically force Brian to come to the hearing if he was going to give them shit. Basically giving them permission to physically grab him and haul his ass here. Brian then tried getting a restraining order against the prison guards to get them to not do this. But the Franklin Superior Court judge, Gregory Rainville, of course denied this. Brian then sent out a statement right before he was due to be sentenced. He wrote a letter to Cuppersmith, which was then released to the public by the Vermont District Court. And in the letter, Brian goes on about how he's a victim, guys. Brian's the victim in this case. Quote, "You got to be in the spotlight and feed into the media frenzy of this public and judicial lynching. You probably expect me to show remorse for this horrible crime that I have been convicted of, which if I had committed this horrible crime, I would have remorse. But being convicted of a crime doesn't always mean that person is guilty. All it means is that the system used whatever means necessary to get a conviction, and 12 jurors bought it. If I attend sentencing, I wish to voice these concerns and other issues that involve this case to the court and public, and will express my sympathy to the family and friends of Michelle Gardner-Quinn." And then finally, on Friday, October 17th, 2008, Brian was officially sentenced to mandatory life without parole behind bars. And at the hearing, which Brian did attend willingly, he proclaimed he was innocent, expressed his condolences to Michelle's parents, and he had a very teary-eyed, woe is me statement that read in part, quote, "I am sorry for what you are going through, but I am not the man responsible for this tragic event, and it saddens me to have to tell you that." He also said he was a victim, as were his daughters, as now they had to grow up without him. "I think they'll be okay not being around a pedophile freak." He said that he was the target of a corrupt legal system and that he had been railroaded. During her victim impact statement, Diane never addressed Brian directly, but said in part, quote, "I have a message from Michelle. When we went to the mortuary to say our goodbyes to her bruised and battered body, strangulation marks on her neck, forehead battered at the first moment that I came over to her side, her essence rose out of her body and said to me, 'The man who killed me has killed before.'" It should be noted that Brian has never been connected to any other murders. Diane went on to say that Vermont should have the death penalty, saying she no longer believed in the reverence for all life as her daughter did. Quote, "There are some people that are so bound in evil, so choked by evil that they cannot change. And for these people, I feel the death penalty is appropriate. If I were to hold Brian Rooney in my left hand and Michelle Gardner-Quinn in my right hand, I would see Brian Rooney strangled by his own evilness, sinking further and further into an endless abyss. And finally, after he had imposed the official mandatory life without parole sentence, Judge Coppersmith went on a 5-minute rant against Brian, saying in part, quote, "Mr. Rooney, let's get one thing straight. You are not a victim in this case, and you have not been victimized. As a criminal defense lawyer, I represented thousands of people. I've been on the bench for over 20 years. I've had thousands of people appear before me, and I'll tell you something. Of all these thousands of people I've seen and I've represented, I can only think of about a half a dozen or maybe a dozen who are beyond redemption, for whom there is no hope. And you, sir, are at the bottom of that list. You are the lowest of the low. Normally, I say good luck, wish you well, but not in your case, Mr. Rooney. I'll leave you to the fate you so rightfully deserve." And after he was officially sentenced, prosecutors in Chittenden and Caledonia counties, they were the ones that had the sexual assault charges, they decided to just drop all of those, since Brian was now in prison, for life without the possibility of parole. However, they could still bring forth these charges at any time in case Brian did somehow get out of prison, or if his conviction was overturned. They still had these charges that they could charge him with. But Attorney General William Sorrell believed that the whole matter was put to bed. Quote, "The arguments we have to make on appeal are strong. It's unlikely we'll need to bring these cases back." Prosecutors also said that the victims in these sexual assault cases, like A.S. and then the other girl from the other charges, Raquel's relative, were okay with them doing this. They had gone to them and they were like, you know what? We're good. He's locked up. People know he did this and we're fine. However, Brian sought to make these charges dropped permanently. He acted as his own attorney before Judge Jeffrey Crawford, and he argued that the state had only brought up the charges in order to hold him as they built their case against him for Michelle's death. He said in part, quote, "If I did win on appeal, I don't want this information used against me." And prosecutors shot back that the state had absolute authority to charge whatever case they wanted. And Judge Crawford agreed. Brian, of course, appealed this decision, but that too was smacked down. Brian also filed a motion to get all of that media that authorities had confiscated from his parents' home, remember, all of that pornography, back into his possession, or at least his parents' possession. Brian was saying that it was mainly family videos and photos. He had defense attorney Josh O'Hara represent him for this particular case, who said, quote, "His position is that anything of value should be returned to his mother." And Gordkowski, remember Rosemary Gordkowski, said, quote, "Most of them did not appear to be family related. Each videotape may have some information that is family related, but interspersed on each videotape is evidence of criminal activity." In the end, Judge Crawford allowed a few inconsequential things to be returned to Brian's family, such as cash and certain digital photos. And then he said that the state and the defense would have to work together and go through the tapes and decide, what could be released and what couldn't. All the while, Brian's murder conviction was still on appeal before the Vermont Supreme Court. In April of 2009, Brian was actually transferred to an out-of-state prison in Mason, Tennessee, at the West Tennessee Detention Facility. Apparently, Vermont does this to avoid overcrowding in their prison systems, so those with super long sentences or life sentences are usually sent out of state to serve their time. However, I think he was transferred again because there was another article about his case that was dated March of 2010, and it said that he was serving his time at the Lee Adjustment Center in Beattyville, Kentucky. And on Wednesday, March 18th, 2010, Brian's appeal went before the Vermont Supreme Court. He was represented by Deputy Public Defender Anna Saxman, who argued the same thing about the DNA evidence. The lab techs were sloppy, that you couldn't rely on it. And then she also argued that the defense had not been allowed some sort of internal reports that the lab had that basically stated how well the machines run. Remember we talked about this earlier, that Slay wanted those reports, but for whatever, I don't know what happened, but Slay ended up not officially requesting those reports. So when Saxman was bringing up this argument on appeal, apparently the judge had ruled that, the defense should have officially requested those before the trial, not now on appeal, it's kind of too late, And they added it wouldn't have necessarily buttressed the defense's position anyway. And on February 4th, 2011, the Vermont Supreme Court affirmed Brian's conviction, and this was in a 3-2 decision, with the majority saying that Slay had made a strategic move in not requesting those validity studies from the lab, and when he had, like, not, like, officially requested those, I guess when he didn't do that, that, like, freed the prosecution from any obligation that they had to turn them over to the defense or something like that. I guess the issue that the justices were split on was the lesser charges that could have been brought up. The dissenting justices said that if they had it their way, Brian would have a whole new sentencing hearing. And Diane finally said of the affirmative ruling, quote, "On behalf of our beloved daughter Michelle, we would like to thank the state of Vermont for putting together a strong prosecution team to present her case. Matt Levine of the Attorney General's office and Rosemary Grodkowski and Brooks MacArthur of the State Attorney's office built a well-crafted case that withstood appeal. It is a relief that it is now over. Michelle loved Vermont, the Intervale, the university, the mountains, and Lake Champlain. Her spirit rests here still." And that was the case of Michelle Gardner-Quinn, who just came across the wrong asshole. Yeah, what do you guys think of this case? Isn't it tragic? It's tragic and upsetting, because how many times have we just asked a stranger, "Oh, hey man, can I use your phone? Oh, hey man, what time is it? Oh, hey, can you give me directions, you know?" And Michelle had to run into this freak who, for whatever reason, had this urge to, like, kill her. I don't know what was going through Brian's mind. I don't know, like, you could say, oh, well, he was drunk or whatever. Yeah, I don't care though. Like, it's not an excuse. Like, people get drunk and do stupid shit, but, like, dear God, to, like, kill someone? Come on. I don't know. Screw Brian. He's a scumbag. His family kind of seems like scumbags. I think his daughters are going to be way better off with him not in their life. And yeah, hopefully the Gardner-Quinns, hopefully Raquel and her family and her daughters can try to heal and live with the trauma that Brian has inflicted, you know? At least he's locked away, you know? Thank you so much to Hova for recommending this case. I had never heard of it. Let me know, have you guys heard of this case? What do you guys think? Let me know all of your thoughts below. And I know I said I was gonna spend a few minutes at the end to kind of go on my rant about my crappy job, but I will wait for next week because we are way over on time. I have a lot to get done, and I'm actually really, really hungry, so I'm gonna go eat right now. I'm very hungry. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for, you know, all of you guys commenting. I know, like, you missed me. That was so sweet. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that my hiatus was extended. Believe me, it was not by choice, but we're back now. So far, you know, knock on wood, we're back. Thank you so much, guys. I will be back next week. Oh, yeah, as far as my crime tip series, I'll probably bring that back, like, next month. I'm trying to still catch up on this channel, and, like the research I do for this channel takes a lot of my time. So I want to focus on my channel and getting ahead for that first, and then I want to bring back, like, the crime dip series and, yeah, kind of see what other true crime cases are happening. Alrighty, guys. Well, until next week, yes, I'll be back next week. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope this month is starting off well for you. We're reaching into summertime. It's summer, finally. Just remember to take care of yourselves out there. Don't be a dick. Don't be a twat. Remember, leave a little sparkle wherever you go, you know? I love that. I love that bumper sticker. I want that now. But yeah, just remember, just don't be an a-hole, dude. Like, especially if any of the recent news reports are any indication, you never know who's armed either. So just be cool, all right? Just be cool, and yeah, stay safe out there, guys. Alrighty, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.